continue for many years in mainstream media.
The Russian government does skew stories, and I've actually, as I've spoken out for Ukraine, I've watched sometimes how they have skewed my words. And so there is a downdraft of propaganda. There is a party that is called the Svoboda Party in Ukraine, and some of the individuals who have been associated with it, you could say, are right of center in the sense that they are intolerant of other people's religions, other people's points of view, and some of them have been banished from the country, actually. That party has been made part of the coalition, the governing coalition, that the Parliament of Ukraine, the Rada, is trying to hold the country together right now. So that is propaganda. And think about it, from the Russian point of view, if you can twist something to talk about Nazis and make Nazis the enemy, right, the Ukrainian people would rise up and fight against it because they suffered at the hands of the Nazis. So it's a very clever political ploy, propaganda.
In 2015, the United States government, apparently recognizing the extremists embedded into the Ukrainian armed forces, quietly took measures by passing a bill. H.R. 4435, a bill presented to give assistance to the Ukrainian military. Limitation of the use of funds for training, equipment, or other assistance for certain units of the organizations or groups in Ukraine. The limitations state none of the funds will be appropriated if the Secretary of Defense has credible information that the unit or its members have taken public stances or have taken actions that are indicative of extremism, including opposition or hostility to the concept of liberal democracy, whatever that means. At the time, the Secretary of Defense under President Obama was Ash Carter.
And I also expect that in coming days, the Russians will begin to suffer casualties in Syria.
The United States government was well aware of Nazism spreading in the Ukrainian military. It was in 2019 that U.S. Congress passed a bill that would get weapons to Ukrainian fighters, but ban them from neo-Nazi groups. This ban turned out to be for naught because rooting out neo-Nazis from other fighters who were not radicalized was something that neither the United States or the Ukraine pursued. The Hill also mentions the Leahy Law, a law that bans weaponizing of extremist groups, though this Leahy Law did not stop the weaponizing of extremists in other countries that the United States backed, such as Syria and Libya.
The members of Congress had been holding a debate on the outcome of the U.S. election.
After the event dubbed the Capitol Riot on 6 January 21, the New York Times ran a story connecting neo-Nazis to the type of people involved in the Winter Riot. Very carefully, the Times prints that the Russian Imperial Movement, a designated terror group, according to the FBI, claims that it was Russians who were training neo-Nazis to fight for both sides in the conflict in the Ukraine. The Times are not the only ones accusing Russia of being the Nazi training capital. A former neo-Nazi follower, Christian Picciolini, was interviewed in May of 20 after he escaped the group and was apparently de-ideologized.
It was the beginning of this normalization of what I used to be, which people recognized as extreme. The point was to be extreme, to make people afraid, but now it's to fool people. We see the exact same imagery in other parts of Eastern Europe. This was a transplanted plan. And in fact, many of the people, not many, but some of the people who were instrumental in the violence in Charlottesville had actually trained in paramilitary camps in Ukraine. Russia really wants to destroy kind of democracy and the West, so that would be their entree in. So it's kind of a really interesting thing, because we have these very open neo-Nazis fighting for Ukraine's freedom, but they're also being funded and kind of promoted by Russian propaganda and things like that. It's a really dangerous thing.
Depending on who you wish to believe, several countries seem to have a hand in training neo-Nazis and nationalist extremists, while everyone seems to deny it. On 17 March of 22, the New York Times wrote an article on why Russian President Vladimir Putin invokes Nazis to justify the invasion of the Ukraine. An excerpt from an open letter from the Scholars of Genocide and Nazism from around the world. This rhetoric is factually wrong, morally repugnant, and deeply offensive. None of this justifies Russian aggression and gross mischaracterization of Ukraine. Ukraine's information minister wrote on Facebook that denazification, a now famous Putin term, was to destroy all Ukrainians, and this is worse than Nazism. The information minister doesn't answer the claim of alleged neo-Nazi atrocities in sections of the country. The question always has been, is the Russian president lying about neo-Nazis or not? A pro-Kremlin analyst retorted by saying that Russia started using Nazi terminology to, quote, get through to Western politicians and media about the necessity of invading Ukraine. People seen in videos over the first few months of 22 tied to electrical poles and telephone poles throughout the cities. These people were beaten while completely defenseless against their attackers. Operation Paperclip, the OSS-CIA operation to relocate apparent de-ideologized Nazis from Germany to various spots across the world, the most prominent of which was Wernher von Braun, a Nazi scientist responsible for later spearheading the U.S. space agency, NASA. U.S. historical revisionists have tried to polish the image of the ex-Nazi Wernher von Braun, suggesting that even though he was a Nazi scientist, he did not believe in Nazi ideology, yet worked for the Reich until early 1945. It was only then, when the Nazis were losing the war, being destroyed by the Soviets, and shortly after von Braun himself was accused of treachery, that von Braun and some of his staff members decided not to surrender to the Russians, but to the Americans. Protection of Nazis by certain U.S. intel outfits seemed to begin as soon as the Second World War ended. 3 countries, the United States, the Ukraine, and Russia, fought and died against the original Nazis. Now the descendants of individuals in each of these countries' governments are engaged in helping these radical groups. What could Ukraine's principal protectors in NATO be thinking about these neo-Nazi allegations? The history of Nazis in NATO also intersects with Operation Paperclip. Adara Press lists the number of Nazis, original Nazis, who escaped Germany after the war and went on to work for NATO in its early days. These Nazis include Nazi General Hans Spiegel, serving as the supreme commander of NATO's ground forces in Central Europe from 57 to 63, a Nazi fighter pilot who worked as a chairman of the NATO Military Committee, 71 to 74, a Nazi general who switched his job to NATO's Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces of Central Europe, 67 to 68, a Nazi major, NATO's Commander-in-Chief of Allied Forces in Central Europe from 73 to 75. The site also mentions several more Nazis turned NATO. Since their defeat in 1945, it seems that governments, political entities, and affluent oligarchs have all played an important role in keeping Nazism alive.
Націоналістичні ідеї. Націоналісти якби були там ключовим фактором однозначно і на фронті. Зараз дуже багато є спекуляцій. Ну, нациків вже ж було небагато, там, ну, ЛГБТшники, там, посольства кажуть, ну, скільки там було там нациків? Ну, нациків там було там 10% там, ну, запаяних, ідейних. Ну, це ж питання в тому, це може так казати лише Йолоб, який не був на війні, не знає, наскільки оцих от 10%, хоча там навіть може даже менше було, я думаю, націоналістів було хай там даже 8%, ну, наскільки це в пропорції ефективності впливу, наскільки це складало просто галопуючи безкінечну підвищення ефективності. Не було б цих 8%, бо ефективність упала б на 90%. То тут не в числі мова. Так само, як на Майдані. Зараз вже почали ліваки, там, фонди Бьоля там, і так далі перераховувати. Ну, націоналістів там було, там, да, вони були впливові. Там. Та які впливові? Не було б націоналістів, все би це от, пішло б сразу на гей-парад.
This whole neo-Nazi business has gotten the Ukrainian National Guard some very negative headlines, not so much on television, but throughout the world web.
Really no merit. You pointed out that Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish. The Jewish community is embraced. It's central to the country, and there is nothing to this Nazi narrative, fascist narrative. It's fabricated as a pretext.
Yes, the United States would know about fabrications when it comes to a pretext for war. After all, they only used to be neo-Nazis for years and years, until the Russian invasion a few months ago. But now, they're not.